On a rainy afternoon, two kids faced a choice most adults would hesitate to make. A motorcycle crash, a man bleeding on the asphalt, and a reputation that made everyone keep their distance. Jill and Alfie didn't know that stopping to help would set off a chain reaction that would reach far beyond anything they could imagine. This is their story. The kitchen table had seen better days. Its surface was scarred with years of use, and one leg wobbled unless you knew exactly where to place the folded napkin underneath. Jill sat there now, counting bills the way she'd learned to do. Twice, sometimes 3 times, making sure the math was right. $23.16. That's what remained until Friday, when their mother's paycheck would come through. Is that enough for Grandma's medicine? Alfie stood in the doorway, backpack already slung over his narrow shoulders. At 12, he was all elbows and knees, growing faster than their budget could keep up with. His jeans stopped a good 2 inches above his ankles. "If we skip the bus," Jill said, tucking the bills into an envelope. She'd already done the math twice. The prescription was $18. The rest would buy rice, eggs, and whatever vegetables were on sale. "We'll walk." Alfie didn't complain. He never did about the walking, even though Jill knew his shoes were falling apart. She'd seen him trying to glue the sole back on last week with craft glue from school. Their mother, Sarah, had already left for her shift at the diner. She worked the breakfast rush, then cleaned houses in the afternoon, then returned to the diner for the dinner crowd. Some days Jill saw her for maybe 20 minutes total. The rest of the time, it was just her and Alfie, figuring things out. Jill packed their grandmother's food into 2 plastic bags: canned soup, bread, a small container of the spaghetti their mother had made last night. Martha would make it last. She was used to it, just like she stretched her medications, taking half doses to make them last longer. The thought made Jill's chest tight. "Ready?" she asked. The walk to Grandma Martha's house was 3 miles through neighborhoods that shifted from struggling to slightly less struggling. Jill kept track of landmarks. The corner store with the faded awning, the house with the chain-link fence and 3 barking dogs, the overpass where trains rumbled by and made Alfie cover his ears. The sky had been heavy and gray all morning, threatening rain that would probably arrive before they made it back home. Alfie kicked a stone along the sidewalk, making a game of keeping it going without losing it to the gutter. "Think Grandma will make us tea?" he asked. "Probably." Martha always did, even though Jill suspected she was rationing her tea bags too. The old woman lived alone in a small house that smelled like lavender sachets and old photographs. She'd been a seamstress once, before her arthritis got bad. Now her hands could barely hold a needle. "We should take the shortcut," Alfie suggested as they approached the fork in the road. "It's gonna rain." The shortcut meant cutting through the industrial district, past the old warehouses and the repair shop where the motorcycle club hung out. Their mother's voice echoed in Jill's head. "Those bikers are nothing but trouble. Stay away from Miller Road." She'd said it enough times that both kids could recite it. Jill looked at the darkening clouds. Fat drops were already starting to fall, sparse but heavy. Mom says a lot of things," Alfie countered, not disrespectfully, just stating fact. "We'll get soaked if we go the long way. And Grandma needs her medicine today, not tomorrow when we're both sick with pneumonia." Jill hesitated, the weight of the pill bottle in her backpack suddenly heavier. If they got caught in this rain too long, Grandma could end up back in the ER. They didn't know what else could happen. He had a point. Jill chewed her lip, feeling the weight of being the responsible one, the decision-maker when their mother wasn't around. The rain picked up, going from drops to a steady drizzle. "Fine, but we walk fast and we don't stop for anything." They turned down Miller Road, where potholes pooled with water and the buildings stood hollow and gray. The repair shop loomed ahead, its parking lot scattered with motorcycles in various states of assembly. Usually there were people around. Men in leather, women with bandanas, the rumble of engines and rough laughter. Today the rain had driven them inside. Jill pulled her jacket tighter. It was too thin for this weather, but it was all she had. Beside her, Alfie had gone quiet, his earlier bravado fading now that they were actually here, in the place they'd been taught to fear. The rain came down harder, turning the world into shades of gray and the sound of water hitting asphalt. They walked faster, heads down, just wanting to get through the stretch and reach the familiar safety of their grandmother's street. That's when they heard it. The scream of tires losing grip, the mechanical shriek of metal twisting, then the wet, heavy sound of something hitting the ground hard. Jill's head snapped up just in time to see the motorcycle sliding sideways across the road, and the man tumbling separately, his body tumbling loose and wrong as it rolled to a stop in a spreading pool of water that was already turning pink. For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain pounded down, and the man lay motionless about 30 feet away, his motorcycle still spinning its back wheel uselessly against the wet asphalt. A slick of rainbow colors spread across the road where oil had leaked. That's what had caused it. The bike had hit that patch and just went sideways. Jill's feet felt welded to the ground. Every warning her mother had ever given her played on repeat in her head. Those bikers are dangerous. Stay away from that shop. They're not people you want to know. Then Alfie dropped his backpack and ran. Alfie, wait! Jill's voice came out strangled, but her brother was already halfway to the man, his small frame cutting through the rain. She had no choice. She couldn't let him go alone. Her legs moved before her brain caught up, and suddenly she was kneeling beside the man on the cold, wet pavement. Up close, he was just a man. Gray in his beard, lines around his eyes. Somebody's father, maybe. His leather jacket was torn at the shoulder, and blood was seeping through, mixing with the rainwater. Is he dead? Alfie's voice was small, scared. Jill pressed shaking fingers to the man's neck, the way she'd seen in a school health video last year. There, a pulse weak but there. No, but he's hurt bad. The man's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glazed with pain. He tried to speak, but only a groan came out. We need to call an ambulance, Jill said, fumbling for her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. The rain was already soaking through her jacket, plastering her hair to her face. She dialed 911, gave the address, Miller Road, near the repair shop, and tried to sound calmer than she felt. They said 10 minutes, she told Alfie, but 10 minutes looked like forever when someone was bleeding on the ground in front of you. She could see the worst of it now. A deep gash on his upper arm where the pavement had torn through the jacket, and his leg bent at an angle that made her stomach turn. But it was the arm that was bleeding the most, pulsing out in rhythmic flows. We have to stop the bleeding. Jill yanked off her jacket, already soaked through, and pressed it against the wound. The man jerked slightly, a weak sound escaping his throat. I know, I'm sorry. Car approached, slowing down. Jill felt a flash of hope. Maybe someone who could help, an adult who knew what to do. But the driver's eyes went from the motorcycle to the man on the ground, and the car sped up again, tires hissing through puddles as it disappeared around the corner. Why didn't they stop? Alfie asked, his voice cracking. Jill didn't answer. She knew why. Same reason her mother had warned them away. Same reason her hands were shaking even as she tried to help. Fear was louder than compassion for most people. Another car slowed. This time Alfie ran toward it, waving his arms. Please, we need help. The window cracked open an inch. You kids should get away from him, a woman's voice said. The tone wasn't cruel, just final. That's not your problem. He's bleeding, Alfie shouted, but the window was already rolling up, the car already moving. Jill pressed harder on the wound, feeling the warmth of the man's blood seeping through the thin fabric of her jacket. She was crying now, though she wasn't sure when that had started. The rain masked it anyway. Stay with us, she whispered to the man, not knowing if he could hear her. His eyes had closed again. The ambulance is coming. Just stay with us. Alfie crouched beside her, his small hand reaching out to touch the man's uninjured hand. You're gonna be okay, he said, with the kind of certainty only kids can muster when they're trying to convince themselves as much as anyone else. The minutes crawled. Jill's arms ached from the pressure she was maintaining. Her jacket was completely soaked now, with rain, with blood. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, loud and fast. The man's eyes opened again, just for a second. This time they focused on her face. There was something in that look. Recognition, maybe, or just the desperate connection of two people in the worst moment of their day. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear over the rain. Then the sirens finally cut through the sound of the storm. The paramedics worked quickly, efficiently, asking Jill questions she tried to answer through chattering teeth. Yes, he'd been unconscious. Yes, she'd applied pressure to the wound. No, she didn't know him. They loaded the man, Ian, she heard one paramedic say, checking his wallet, onto a stretcher and into the ambulance. Before the doors closed, Ian's eyes found hers one more time. He was conscious now, barely, his face pale against the white of the ambulance interior. He raised one hand slightly, a gesture that might have been a wave or a thank you or just a tremor from shock. Then the doors slammed shut and the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing. Jill and Alfie stood alone on Miller Road, soaked to the bone, covered in a stranger's blood. Jill's jacket was gone. The paramedics had taken it, still pressed against Ian's wound. Her whole body was shaking now, adrenaline draining away and leaving nothing but cold and shock in its wake. "Come on," she managed to say. "We still need to get to Grandma's." They walked the rest of the way in silence, the plastic bags with Martha's food swinging between them, still waiting to be delivered. Martha's house appeared through the rain like a refuge. The yellow porch light was on, glowing warm against the gray afternoon. Before Jill could knock, the door swung open. Her grandmother stood there in her floral house dress, her face shifting from welcome to alarm in an instant. "Sweet Jesus, what happened to you two?" They must have looked like something out of a horror movie. Jill glanced down at herself, her shirt splattered with rust-colored stains, her arms streaked red where the rain hadn't washed it all away. Alfie's jeans were soaked through, his sneakers squelching with every step. "We're okay, Grandma," Jill said, but her voice shook, giving her away. Martha pulled them inside, already moving toward the bathroom for towels. "Sit, both of you. Don't move." She returned with an armful of faded towels that smelled like the lavender sachets she kept in every drawer. "Now tell me." The story came out in fragments. Alfie started, his words tumbling over each other about the crash and the oil slick and the man's motorcycle spinning. Jill filled in the rest, the blood, the cars that didn't stop, the ambulance. She left out the part about how scared she'd been, how her hands were still shaking even now, wrapped in a towel, how she'd been certain that Ian would die right there on the pavement while she watched. Martha listened without interrupting, her weathered hands gripping the armrest of her chair. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You did the right thing," she finally said. "I've lived long enough to know. Some moments define who you are. Doesn't matter what kind of jacket someone wears, you don't walk away from a dying man." Jill felt something loosen in her chest. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that. Martha made them weak tea, the kind that was more hot water than actual tea, and called their mother. Sarah arrived 40 minutes later, still wearing her diner uniform, her hair escaping its ponytail. She'd left work the moment Martha called, which meant losing those hours of pay, but Jill could see she didn't care about that right now. Sarah pulled both kids into a hug that squeezed the air from their lungs. "Are you hurt? Either of you hurt?" "No, Mom," Jill said into her shoulder. "We're fine." But Sarah held them longer anyway, and when she finally pulled back, her eyes were wet. "You scared me. When Mom said there was an accident, that there was blood." She stopped, pressing her lips together hard. "But I'm proud of you." Terrified, but proud. That night, Sarah didn't go back to the diner. She called in and took the loss of wages, and the three of them, four with Martha, sat in the small living room eating soup and not talking about much of anything. Jill caught her mother watching her and Alfie with an expression she couldn't quite read. Worry, maybe. They slept at Martha's that night, curled up on the pull-out couch that had a bar that dug into your back no matter how you positioned yourself. Jill lay awake for hours, listening to Alfie's breathing beside her and the rain still pattering against the windows. Every time she closed her eyes, She saw Ian's face, pale and slack, and felt the warmth of his blood seeping through her jacket. The next day moved like molasses. School was a blur. Jill's English teacher asked her a question she didn't hear, and she had to ask him to repeat it 3 times. At lunch, her best friend Maya asked why she seemed so spaced out, but Jill didn't know how to explain. How do you tell someone about saving a stranger's life before breakfast? Alfie was quieter than usual too. During lunch, he'd barely touched his sandwich, just torn it into small pieces while staring at nothing. She caught him drawing in his notebook during math class. Not the usual doodles of dragons or spaceships, but motorcycles this time, like that idea wouldn't leave his head. After school, they went back to Martha's house. It had become their routine. Help with whatever needed doing, make sure she'd eaten, make sure she'd taken her medications properly. Today, she needed help changing the sheets on her bed, which required Jill to lift the mattress corner while Martha struggled with arthritic hands to tuck in the fitted sheet. Have you heard anything? Martha asked. About that man? Jill shook her head. She thought about calling the hospital, but what would she even say? She wasn't family. She was nobody to him. I'm sure he's all right, Martha said, but it sounded like she was trying to convince herself too. The afternoon stretched on. Alfie helped Martha organize her medicine cabinet while Jill swept the kitchen floor. Everything felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath. Then, around 4:30, they heard it. At first, Jill thought it was thunder, a low rumble in the distance. But it didn't fade. It grew louder, multiplying, until the sound wasn't coming from the sky but from the street. She moved to the window, pulling back the curtain. Motorcycles, a line of them stretching down the block, rolling to a stop in front of Martha's house. 10, 15, 20, she lost count. Men and women in leather vests dismounting, their faces serious. More kept coming, parking wherever they could find space. Mom, Jill called, her voice strange in her own ears. Sarah appeared from the kitchen, dish towel still in her hands. She looked out the window and went pale. Stay behind me, both of you. Martha had come to look too, leaning on her cane. Lord have mercy, she whispered. They moved to the front door as a group. Through the glass, Jill could see someone approaching the porch. A man, limping slightly, his arm in a sling, bandages visible beneath his partially unbuttoned shirt. Ian. He was alive. He was standing on Martha's porch. And behind him, 20-some bikers stood in the rain, holding plastic bags and cardboard boxes, waiting. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. Sarah opened the door slowly, positioning herself between her children and whatever was coming. Ian stood there, his face drawn with pain but his eyes clear. Up close, without the rain and blood and panic, Ian looked tired. Human. Ma'am, he said, his voice rough. I'm Ian Cooper. I don't want to frighten you or your family. He stopped, his throat working. Your kids saved my life 2 days ago. Sarah's grip on the doorknob tightened, but she didn't speak. The doctor said if they'd waited any longer to get pressure on that artery, I would have bled out before the ambulance arrived. Ian's eyes found Jill behind her mother's shoulder. You did that. A 14-year-old kid did what 3 adults in cars wouldn't stop to do. Jill felt her face flush. Beside her, Alfie had gone very still. Ian gestured back toward the street. My club, the Road Knights, we wanted to say thank you properly. We know your family's been struggling. We know your grandmother lives alone and could use help. So we brought some things. We don't need charity, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. This isn't charity, ma'am. It's paying back what's owed. Ian's voice was firm but respectful. Those kids didn't have to stop. They were scared. I could see it in her eyes, but they stopped anyway. That kind of courage deserves recognition. One of the women from the group approached, her gray hair in a long braid. She carried 2 cloth grocery bags that looked heavy. 6 months of dry goods, she said gently. Rice, beans, pasta, canned vegetables. Basics. Things that keep. Another man came forward with a box. Winter coats for the kids. My daughter outgrew hers. Barely worn. They kept coming, one after another, setting things on the porch. Bags of groceries, boxes labeled with Martha's medications, thick envelopes that Jill suspected held more than thank you cards. Someone had even brought a space heater for Martha's bedroom, which got cold at night. Martha had tears running down her weathered cheeks. Sarah stood frozen, her professional pride warring with the overwhelming relief of not having to choose between electricity and food for a while. "There's one more thing," Ian said. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "My buddy owns Cooper's Auto. Your car's been sitting broken for months, right?" He handed the paper to Sarah. "It's fixed. New alternator, oil change, inspection done. Keys are with the front desk whenever you want to pick it up." Sarah's hand shook as she took the paper. We can't accept all this." Jill watched her mother's throat work, trying to swallow past whatever was blocking it. Pride, relief, shame at needing help. Maybe all three. "Yes, you can," Martha said firmly from behind them, her cane tapping as she moved forward. "These people are trying to do something good. Let them." Ian looked at Jill again. "You gave me my life back. Let us give you a little breathing room. That's all this is." The tension in Sarah's shoulders finally broke. She nodded once, sharp, and then whispered, "Thank you." The bikers didn't linger. They unpacked everything, stacking it neatly in Martha's living room until it looked like a small grocery store, then mounted their bikes and left as they'd come, in a rumble of engines and a wave of hands. Life didn't transform overnight, but it eased, slowly in ways that mattered. Sarah picked up the car and cried in the parking lot for 10 minutes before driving it home. The winter coats fit Alfie and Jill perfectly. Martha's pantry stayed full, and she stopped rationing her medications. But the ripples spread further than just their family. Ian's story made its way through the Motorcycle Club's network, then jumped to a local news blog. A reporter reached out, wanting to interview Jill and Alfie, but Sarah politely declined. "They're just kids," she told the reporter. "They don't need attention. They just did what was right." The Road Knights started something new, a weekly delivery service for isolated elderly residents in Martha's neighborhood. Every Saturday morning, riders would show up with groceries, check on people, help with small repairs. They recruited volunteers from all over, people who'd once crossed the street to avoid them. Jill and Alfie went back to being kids. They went to school, did homework, argued over who had to do dishes. But something had changed in how people looked at them. The neighbors on Martha Street would wave. The riders who came by on Saturdays would nod with respect. One Saturday in late autumn, Jill and Alfie were at Martha's house helping her plant bulbs for spring when 3 motorcycles pulled up. Ian climbed off, moving easier now, the sling gone. "Wanted to check in," he said. "See how everyone's doing." "Good," Jill said, dirt under her fingernails, feeling suddenly shy. "We're good." Ian watched them work for a moment. "You know what you did, right? It wasn't just about me." Jill shrugged, uncomfortable with the weight he was trying to put on that rainy afternoon. "You showed people that fear doesn't have to win," Ian continued. "That we're all just people underneath the leather and the rumors. Half our new volunteers told me they joined because they heard about 2 kids who were braver than they'd ever been." Alfie looked up from the hole he was digging. "We were really scared, though." "I know," Ian said softly. "That's what made it brave." He didn't stay long. Before he left, he pressed something into Jill's hand. A small silver pin shaped like a road stretching into the horizon. "Road Knights give these to people who embody what we're about. Loyalty, courage, looking out for each other. You earned it." That evening, as the sun set orange and gold over Martha's neighborhood, Jill sat on the porch steps pinning the small silver road to her jacket. Inside, she could hear Alfie laughing at something on TV, her mother and grandmother talking in the kitchen. The family car sat in the driveway, reliable again. The pantry was full. Winter coats hung by the door. And somewhere across town, volunteers were loading up groceries for next Saturday's deliveries, carrying forward something that had started on a rainy afternoon with 2 kids who made a choice. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is see past our fear and recognize someone else's humanity. What would you have done in their shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Embrace the Journey for more true stories about ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.